haven't been here, we started a new series a couple weeks ago called The Story of the Torah. And we're trying to get our minds around what is the storyline through these first 5 books. Or actually, I should say the first 5 scrolls, because that's what they were. Um, if you don't know this technology called a book is a modern technology. You didn't know that. You thought your phone was modern. This is modern too. So the Old Testament is written on scrolls. So you had a Genesis scroll, you had an Exodus scroll, and so on and so forth. So, and if you've ever read those books, Genesis and Exodus, it's pretty long, isn't it? Imagine how long that scroll's got to be. You should see the Isaiah scroll. We have one that comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls that was found in the mid 1900s, but the scrolls themselves come from the first century or even older, um, first century AD, or some of those scrolls are actually older than that. The Isaiah scroll, if we unrolled it, it would go down this wall and down that wall and probably down part of this one, and it's massive. So anyway, these were scrolls. That's what I was talking about. So we're going to talk about the Exodus scroll tonight. So Exodus obviously picks up right where Genesis left off. So the end of Genesis, we found out that Joseph and all of his brothers and all of them are in the land of Egypt. Yes. All right. Good. One Bible scholar. All right. They're in Egypt and everything's going good, right? Joseph was in favor with the Pharaoh. Pharaoh loves Joseph. He put him in charge of everything because Joseph is getting his wisdom from Yahweh, God. He's able to devise a plan to keep them from starving to death during the famine, so they store up for 7 years and all that, and then there's going to be this famine. So Joseph's wonderful plan that saves a nation. And what we're supposed to remember in that is what God told Abraham back in the middle of the Genesis scroll. In chapter 12, he says, I'm going to bless all nations through you, right? Remember that? That was God's promise to Abraham. So Joseph, who's a descendant of Abraham, goes to a nation called Egypt and blesses them by saving them during the famine. So what you're supposed to think is God's keeping his promise. He's blessing the nations through the line of Abraham. All right, so the story ends. Everything's great. They're in the land of Egypt. They've got a whole area of land that Pharaoh has given them, and they're able to live and just be great. I mean, Egypt's a prosperous land. It's a great place to live, but it turns bad really quick. So if you get into Exodus, what you're going to find out, and I love these, I know you can't read any of this. I'll zoom in to different parts of it as we walk through the story. But what you'll find out is that there's 2 main sections of the scroll of Exodus. So the Bible Project guys who do this, they're really big on the literary design of these documents. So and I like it because it gives me like a framework. It's like, okay, these aren't just words on a page. There's a design to it. There's a way it's supposed to be read in sections, So you got 2 sections for this. The first 18 chapters is the first section. That's going to be all about them in Egypt and how God gets them out of Egypt and the plagues and all that. We're going to dig into the plagues tonight. Have fun with that. And then, you didn't know you could have fun talking about plagues, did you? So, and then the next part is chapters 19 through 40, and that's when they're camped out at Mount Sinai, and Moses is getting the law, the 10 Commandments. Of course, there's more than 10, but he's getting all that information from God, and there's a whole really interesting story that goes along with all that. So that's the 2 main sections. Okay, so we got our minds around that, right? All right. Now, when we get to the end tonight, if we don't run out of time, I'm going to really focus on, after we get through this chart, this storyline, I want to focus on why this matters. Why is this story important for us Christians today? Because that's a lot of times we avoid the Old Testament. One, because it's kind of hard to read and hard to figure out what's going on. That's one reason. The other big reason is, we don't see why that matters for the New Testament, right? Because we're New Testament people. We're in the New Covenant. Why do I need to spend all this time in the Old Covenant? So at the end tonight, I want to really hone in on why this is really important, because this story is vital to understand the Jesus story. That'll make sense at the end. So just tuck that in your pocket. We'll come back to it. All right. Okay. So I'm going to kind of move fast because Exodus is a big scroll. It's 40 chapters. If you look in your notes on the Faith Life app, I have outlined the entire book, chapter by chapter. Some of the chapters I grouped together. I gave you a little heading, and then I wrote like a short paragraph to kind of summarize what's going on in that chapter or section. And then I gave you like a key verse. Maybe not on all of them, but on a lot of them, I give you like a key verse. Did the same thing in Genesis last week. So you can scroll through that. The idea there is to download the PDF of that if you want to, stick it in your Bible, so when you're reading your Bible, you've got an outline right next to you and you know where you're at. The other cool thing about these charts, and this is what I do with these, I print them out, I fold them in half, and I stick them in the book that the chart is about. So I would put this one in Exodus. So when I'm reading Exodus, I fold out this thing. This is like a map for my reading. I can look at and go, okay, this is where I'm at in the story. I'm reading this part right now. It just helps you to kind of stay along with the storyline. All right? Okay, so let's dig in. You ready? We're going to kind of go fast. You can stop me at any moment and ask a question, or if something's confusing or whatever, or if I'm moving too fast and you need me to slow down, just let me know. All right, so let's zoom in here. So Exodus is going to begin with kind of connecting us back to the end of Genesis. I love how Moses did that for us. When Exodus starts, you find out that Joseph and the descendants of Israel and all that, there's 70 people, right? We found that out at the end of Genesis, and he tells you that again. And he drops this little line in there that you're supposed to tie back to Genesis 1. And that is, Israel was fruitful and multiplied and filled the land. Where have we heard that before? Genesis 1. That was the divine blessing over humanity, remember? He also gave that to the animals and the fish. Hey fish, your blessing is make more fish, fill up the ocean. Why? Because there's these other people he's going to make people who might need to eat those fish, right? Later on in the storyline, okay? And it's also vital for the ecosystem and all that scientific stuff that I can't explain, all right? And he says the same thing to the animals, be fruitful and multiply. And then he makes humans, and he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the land and rule and have dominion over it. So what is he doing there? He's putting humans in charge. Now, that doesn't mean God's not in charge anymore. It means that God's way of ruling the earth is to make humans who will rule the earth in his good way. Of course, they didn't do that. They rebelled and all that stuff. What we're being told at the beginning of Genesis is God's divine mandate in Genesis 1, which was restarted with Noah in Genesis 9 when they got off the boat. He says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the land. And Noah's story went the way it went. We don't have time to get into that tonight. And then later on, in chapter 12, he's going to get to Abraham and say, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. I'm going to multiply you. You're going to fill a land that I'm going to give to you. And then by the time Exodus happens, the promise is still reigning true. Okay? So that's what we need to get out of the first part. Now, they're going to spend 400 years in Egypt. That's a lot of years. Okay? Now, if what you're supposed to read, now you might have missed this in Genesis, but in Genesis, I think it's 15. I don't know. Should have put it in your notes somewhere. God tells Abraham, all right, I'm going to take you into this land, but your descendants are going to be oppressed or put into slavery or be servants in a nation, and after that I will bring them into this land. So he told Abraham this a long time ago. All right? And you're going to find out they get to Egypt, everything's good and all that. Some time goes by, and there's a new Pharaoh. New Pharaoh comes to power, and he doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't know anything about Joseph. He doesn't care about Joseph. He doesn't care about the Hebrews, the Israelites. So he looking around, and he's like, there's a lot of these Hebrews in our land, like a lot of them. Our land is filled with them, literally. So he's looking around and he's going, this is not good, because what if the Hebrews decide that they want to take our land over and own Egypt? Well, that's not good. So we got to prevent them from continuing to multiply and fill the land. So what this new Pharaoh does is he puts them into slavery. Okay, so they go from a really good people group, well respected in Egypt. Pharaoh loves them. That Pharaoh dies. A new Pharaoh arises and says, no, we got to change this. So now they get put into slavery. And Pharaoh's thinking is, if I keep them busy building stuff, they won't have time to make more children. Right? And it doesn't work. Actually, the text is going to tell you right there in the first chapter that the more he oppressed them, the more they multiplied. It's almost like, the edict of Pharaoh goes out and goes, we're going to make you work longer hours. And it's like somebody in Israel announced to the Israelites, all right, the harder they work us, the harder we're going to work at nighttime. We're going to make more kids, So the more they get oppressed, the more they multiply. So Pharaoh says, all right, my plan didn't work. So new plan. He goes to the Hebrew midwives. So these are Israelite ladies. And he says, every time a male is born who's an Israelite, kill them. So when you deliver a male Hebrew child, kill it right then. If it's a girl, let it live. But if it's a boy, kill the baby right there. And the Hebrew midwives, because they're people of Yahweh who loves life, he's the author of life, they're not going to do that, so they don't. They don't kill the children. So his next plan is, okay, I'm going to take and I'm going to tell my entire kingdom of Egypt, every Hebrew child that's a boy must be thrown into the Nile River. So that happens, and that's where the story of Moses starts, because Moses' mom puts him in an ark and floats him down the river, and he ends up in Pharaoh's family. Right? Yes? Remember that? Okay. So Pharaoh's plan to destroy them doesn't work. And this concept in chapter 1 that Pharaoh is going to kill the male Israelites. Can you think of a story that's coming very soon in Exodus where a lot of Egyptian children are going to be killed? So God does to Pharaoh what Pharaoh had done to God's people. So there's a connection there. Anyway, if I go this slow, we'll be here all night. All right, so long story short, Moses begins to realize, okay, he grows up in Pharaoh's house, okay, but he learns somehow over time, I'm not an Egyptian, I'm an Israelite. And anyway, so there's a conflict thing where he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. He gets mad, loses his temper, kills the Egyptian, which means now I got to leave town. So there's that story, and it's going to tell you that story as you read Exodus. So eventually he comes back because God calls him. So God meets with Moses, and do you remember the first time Moses meets God? How does God show up to Moses the first time? The burning tree. Yeah, it's a glowing tree. Anybody making the connection? Tree of life in the garden? Okay, you're supposed to be tracking with us the whole time. Okay, so there's this burning bush, tree in Hebrew, basically the same things. Bush is a small tree. And he speaks to him and he tells him, long story short, you're going to go to Pharaoh and you're going to tell him to let my people go. Right? And of course, Moses argues with God. Moses is a true Israelite. Israel, man who struggles with God. There's Moses. So he argues with God and he comes up with these excuses. I can't do this. I don't talk very well. I stutter or whatever. And he says, well, I'll get your brother Aaron. He'll be the speaker, but you're going to do what I tell you to do. So there's that whole story. And eventually he goes and he starts the confrontation. Now, and I put this in your notes, I think, but there's this whole concept through these plagues where you're going to see this idea of Pharaoh's heart being hardened. You remember this in the story? Now, there's a whole branch of theologians and people called Reformed theology or Calvinism or whatever you want to call that. They really like this part of the story that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So I'm not going to get into that whole debate about is God forcing Pharaoh to sin or is Pharaoh sinning. Here's the answer. All right, we're not going to argue about it. Here's the answer. Throughout the plagues, when you read through these, you're going to see two things. You're going to see it say Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and then as it progresses, it changes to, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. So is Pharaoh hardening his own heart, or is God hardening Pharaoh's heart? Yes. Let's be Easterners now, not Westerners. Yes is the answer. So the way I take that, and it's just my opinion, the way I take that is God knows Pharaoh is going to continue to act like he's God. He's going to harden his own heart. He's going to be hard-hearted about this the whole time. And as it progresses, God's going to step in and finish the job. Okay, you're not going to do this. I know you're not going to do this. I'm going to make sure that you don't do what I'm telling you to do in the end because I'm going to get the glory out of this. I need my people to see me do this. Yes? So God is saying, I need to show off for my people by proving that your gods don't work. So that's what's going on. So it's free will and God together doing something. He hardened his own heart, and God did the same to him. So, all right, don't need to spend a lot of time on that. Okay, we'll talk about plagues. Now, you might not realize this. What's going on in the plagues, there's 10 of them. God speaks 10 words of plagues. 10 words. When's the last time God spoke 10 times in the storyline of the Torah? God said, that's that way in the story. Well, we're reading Hebrew. Actually, we're going this way. Creation story. God spoke 10 times in the creation story. He's going to speak 10 times to describe 10 plagues that are going to be destructive. So what's he doing here? This is a decreation of Egypt and their gods. So he speaks 10 times in the creation story. And you're probably thinking, why does that matter? Because that's how ancient Israelites would have read this story. They would have noticed this. And we want to learn how to read it like they did, right? Okay? So what's going on here is he's basically decreating Israel. Now the part that you probably have never heard before is that, and it's right there in your Bible. I'm not making this up. I'm not pulling this out of my hat. I'm not wearing. Yeah, that was close. It tells us right in the text multiple times that God is judging the gods of Egypt. Now, you probably never heard that, probably never noticed it. You probably read right past it because you've always thought that the other gods aren't real. Well, but we've learned this already. The other gods that we see mentioned in the Bible, they're not God, supreme creator. They're spiritual beings who rebelled against God. Yes? Remember that? Okay. So when you see the word gods, the word there is Elohim. It's the plural, and it means spiritual beings who God created, but they rebelled against him. All right, so a few of them are down in Egypt, and they're getting these Egyptians to worship them as if they're God. Yes? So God's going to show up and say, no, 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 I'm God. These are puny little spiritual beings that want to act like God. And every one of these plagues are directly tied to an Egyptian god. Now you might say, how do you know that? Because the text doesn't say that. Well, because of archaeology and Egyptian text, we know what they called their gods, and we know what they believed about their gods. The Egyptians loved to write things down and draw on walls. Yeah? Pyramids, you go into, or the tombs of the pharaohs, they're covered in hieroglyphics, right? That's language. They're telling a story. So we've deciphered through all that. And when you do that, you start going, wait a minute. I think this God is what God was dealing with in Egypt. Okay, so that's what we're about to do. We're going to go through the plagues. I'm going to tell you which little God, that the big God is kicking butt. Okay, this is awesome. This is going to be fun. Okay, or at least it's going to be fun for me. I don't know what it's going to do for you. All right, plague 1. These are the plagues here. The first one is God turns the Nile River into blood. Okay, you remember, if you grew up in church, you know these stories, or you think you do, right? So he turns the water to blood. Now, the Nile River is a big deal in Egypt. Yes? Yeah, it's a big deal. It's a water source. I mean, it water. If you go to Google Earth and you zoom in to Egypt and you go where the Nile's at, what you'll see is a bunch of sand, desert, and where that river is, it's just lush and green on both sides of that river, all the way to the ocean, right? So I mean, this thing is a big deal. So God says, okay, I'm going to show them what I can do to their main source in Egypt, their main source of life. So he turns it to blood. Now, there's several gods in Egypt that are associated with the Nile River. And it's hard to know which one exactly he's dealing with in this, but we'll just say he's kicking butt for all of them. All right? So, Kunum, I think I'm pronouncing that right. I don't study Egyptian, so I don't know. He was the guardian of the river's source. So they believed he was the God who kept the river flowing, the source of the river flowing. Okay. There was another god that they had that was the god of flooding and fish. Flooding and fish. If you read the plague, what dies and floats to the top in the river? The fish, and it smells really bad, right? Okay, so he's dealing with that. Osiris was a god who drew his life from the Nile River. That's what they believed, that the god Osiris was empowered by the river Nile. All right? So basically, God is showing the Egyptians that all your gods that you associate with this river, they're now out of business. Because I can turn their river to complete blood and kill everything in it. So do you see what's going on here? Now, in going back through this, I found some things that I don't ever remember reading before, and I've read these stories a lot, and somehow I just missed this, okay? The Egyptian magicians are mentioned in this story in a few of the plagues. And the interesting part is they can do some tricks, but they're not tricks. So God turns the Nile to blood, and it tells us in Exodus chapter 7, verse 22, that the magicians, who are the priest, basically, it's the same word for priest, their Egyptian priest could also turn water to blood. So they actually had some kind of spiritual power these demonic gods had been giving them. So the magicians, the priest, whatever you want to call them, they're able to do the same trick. They're like, oh, Moses, your God can turn water to blood. Well, watch this. And they do it too. So Pharaoh goes, your God's not God. And he refuses to let the people go. Now, the interesting thing, if you think about this, the magicians it might be cool they could do the trick, but they couldn't fix the problem. They could only make it worse. Right? They can turn water to blood. It doesn't say, and they showed up and just walked up to the Nile and went, water, and it turned back to water. They couldn't reverse what God had done, but they could do a trick. So Pharaoh's like, oh, well, if my prophets can do the same thing your God's doing, then I'm not letting your people go. But all they could do was make the problem worse. They couldn't fix the problem. Get it? Okay? So as you're reading this, just be thinking about that, because that's how the ancient readers would have been reading it. Okay, the second plague is frogs. Anybody like frogs in here? No? Eat them? Frog legs? Yeah. So there's this plague of frogs, where frogs are going to be everywhere, right? And they mostly would stay around the river, but now they're coming to town, right? So frogs were very common in their culture. They actually had a goddess who was a goddess over frog multiplication. That god's name is Heket. You have to hock it a little bit. Heket. Egyptian goddess, and when you look at the hieroglyphics, this goddess has the head of a frog. And they believe this because frogs were very vital to the ecosystem of the Nile, so they believe that God was in control of that. So Yahweh shows up and goes, okay, I know that God that y'all worship, that you think it controls reproduction of frogs, but watch this. I'm going to make a multitude of them, and they're not staying at the river. They're coming to town. And not only to town, they're going to be in your bed tonight. When you pull the covers back, your bed's going to be full of frogs. I don't know about y'all, but it's like, okay, we're burning the bed now. I'm not sleeping in a frog bed. So that's what he's doing. He's showing them your gods are now out of business. I'm greater than your gods. And the magicians can actually do the same on this one. But they can't make less frogs. They can just make more frogs. And Pharaoh doesn't get it. Like if I was Pharaoh, I'd have been like, wait a minute, you're only making the problem worse here. We need less frogs, guys. You're just making more of them, okay? So the next plague number 3, is gnats or lice. If you're reading the King James Version, I think it says lice, right? Nobody's looking at a Bible, so I guess nobody brought one. Okay. So this one, there's a lot of stuff going on here that is not in the text, but we know from Egyptian culture. They had a god who was a god over the dust, like dirt, and they believed that that's where gnats and insects and stuff could come from. So if this god was mad at them, then they would have all these flies and gnats in town. But if they had appeased this god, then he would keep them in the dust, right? Okay, now the other thing you need to know is Egyptian temples, just like God's temple, is sacred space. All right, so when they go into their Egyptian temple to one of their gods, they have to be pure. So one of the things the Egyptian priests would do is every other day they would completely shave themselves. Completely. They would be completely shaved, and the reason they did that is because where do lice like to live? In your hair. So they kept all the hair off of their body so they would not be impure or unclean to go into the temple to appease the god. Yeah? So what does God do? Our God. What does he do? He says, well, I will infest you with the thing that makes you so you can't even go into your temple. That's what's going on here. He's kicking butt for sure. So he's put frogs in their bed. He's turned their water source to blood and killed all their fish. And now he's stopping their religious practices. Because if the priests can't go in the temple, we can't appease our gods. It's bad. In the Egyptian world, in the ancient world, if you could not serve your God, it was chaos. Because we don't know, he might get mad, he might not rain on our crops, or he might flood the land, or he might send tigers in here to eat us all. Like, that's how they thought, right? So they can't do any of this stuff. Now, the interesting thing is the magicians in Egypt can't pull this one off. That's interesting. So Yahweh creates gnats or lice to infest Egypt, and the magicians who could do all the other tricks can't create. See what's going on here? God can create, Yahweh can create, but the Egyptian priest can't create. They can do these little tricks, but they can't create insects out of nothing. What message is that communicating? Well, for Moses, it communicates, hey, Yahweh, my God, is the creator. Your magicians can't do this. So, and what's interesting is they tell Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 8, verses 18 and 19, they tell Pharaoh, they can't do it, and they say, Pharaoh, this is the finger of God doing this. Because he can do something we can't. Now, isn't that interesting? This is the finger of Elohim. Singular. Not plural, not God's. This is not the finger of the gods. This is the finger of God. So they know something's up. This God that Moses is talking about, he's the real deal. Because we can't do what he just did. And what's interesting is after this one, you don't hear anything about the magicians trying to do more tricks. They tell Pharaoh, this is God, the big one. Big G. So don't call us back. We're not doing any more tricks. They get mentioned later in the story, but they're not performing anything. They're just infested with whatever the plague is going on. But they don't try anymore after this one. That's pretty cool, huh? So Pharaoh should have got the point, but of course he doesn't. He hardens his heart. And then the next one is flies, which is very closely related to the gnats or lice. They had a god Khepri who was he had his depiction. He has the head of a beetle or a insect, a flying insect. And they believed that Khepri helped to move the sun across the sky. Now we're going to hear about the god Ra in just a minute. But he basically helped Ra, the sun god, get across the sky in the daytime. This plague has a different effect. So the flies come in. It's a bad deal. But in this one we're told that nothing's affecting the Israelites. Yeah? So God has carved out the Israelites, and while all this terrible stuff is happening to the Egyptians, they look over and the Israelites are like, how y'all doing? They're just fine, right? So this gets Pharaoh's attention, and he tells Moses, okay, look, I'm not letting all y'all leave, but you go out and make a sacrifice to your God. And while you're there, ask him to stop it. Okay, go offer a sacrifice to him. Maybe you'll make him happy. And when he's happy, ask him, stop this, please. This is bad. And he does. So he goes and he prays, and God takes the flies out. That's it. Okay, you asked me, I'll do it. Pharaoh should have been like, okay, your God is God. All right, everyone's going to worship Yahweh now. But that's not what happens. He still hardens his heart. The next plague is cattle. So, here it is. Yeah, the dead, skeleton, cow skeleton, that's what it is. They had a god named Hathor, probably pronouncing that wrong, but it was the fertility goddess, and the depiction of this god has either bull's horns or it has a bull head. Okay? So that's what their god looked like in their mind. So what does God do for that? Well, he kills all the cows, all the horses, all the donkeys, all the camels, and the herds and the flocks in the land of Egypt. but not the cattle and the herds and the flocks and the horses that the Israelites had. So he's basically saying, your God of fertility that you think is like a bull god, he's out of business. She's taking a vacation because I can wipe out all of your animals. So what we need to think, if we get back into the ancient world and put ourselves in their mindset, what the Egyptians were seeing was our gods must not be able to defeat Moses' God. That's what's going on here. It's a battle of the gods. Okay? So, all right, if our God, our bull God, is in charge of making sure we have plenty of cattle and all this, and Moses, rides up in here and goes, yeah, well, my God's Yahweh, and he's better than your God. Watch this. And all of your livestock are gone. That communicates to you. You're going to go home that night thinking, maybe Moses' God is God. Maybe Moses' God is more powerful than our gods. That's what's going on in this story. And apparently that occurred because at the end of the plagues, when he finally lets them leave, the Bible tells us explicitly that a mixed multitude of people left Egypt with the Israelites. And I looked that up in Hebrew. Mixed multitude means Hebrew people and non-Hebrew people. Different races of people left. It wasn't just the Israelites who left Egypt. It was mostly Israelites. Some of the Egyptians were like, oh, they're leaving? And their God, Yahweh's going with them? All right, we're going with them. Right? Because we're not staying here with you, Pharaoh. You're an idiot. We're going with the Hebrews. And then they get out in the desert, and Moses is like, everyone has to be circumcised. And they're like, we're going back to Egypt. All right, so that didn't happen. I'm just saying. It probably did. It wasn't written down. The next one is the boils or the sores, where everybody kind of gets like a leprosy-looking disease. Now, there's a couple Egyptian gods. Isis is the goddess of health. And Imhotep is the god of healing. They worship them as the god of healing, god of health. So God is showing them, your God's out of business. I'm going to make you sick, and your God's not going to be able to do anything about it. Yeah? He's proven his point pretty well, isn't he? Now, in this one, Exodus chapter 9, verse 12 tells us, this is when you start seeing that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Up to this point, it's said different ways, but it's telling you that Pharaoh hardened his heart. So Pharaoh's hardening his own heart. And at this point, God's stepping in and saying, I'm going to make sure we finish the job on this one. The very next plague is hail. And there's a couple gods that we know about here associated with this. Newt, it's spelled nut. Your God's a nut. Newt was the goddess of sky, the skies, and her father, Shu, was the god of wind and air. Okay, so what's God doing here? All right, well, he seems to be proving that their gods of weather are out of business. Right? I can rain down stuff on you, and you can cry out to your God and goddesses all day long, and nothing's going to change. I'm a better God than your gods. Now, what's interesting in this plague is God tells Moses, he says, now, when you go tell these people this is about to happen, because that's how it went down. He would go to Pharaoh and say, Yahweh says, let us go. And he goes, He says, okay, now this is going to happen. And he tells him what's about to happen. He sometimes even tells him what time. And then he leaves and they watch it happen. So God tells Moses, he says, when you go to Pharaoh, I want you to tell him what's coming. I'm going to rain down hail. It's going to destroy crops. It's going to kill animals. It's going to kill people if they don't get out of the weather. They don't get into the shelter. And he says, and tell Pharaoh to go tell the nation This is going to happen at this time, so you had better get inside, or you're going to die. You better bring your animals in, or they're going to die. What is that? What's going on there? God's giving the Egyptians a chance to be delivered. You can stand out in the open and say you don't believe what Yahweh says, and you're going to get pummeled to death. Or you can believe what Yahweh says and go inside and be saved. I don't mean saved in the eternal sense. I mean saved from the calamity, delivered from it. That's interesting. So he's giving them a way out. The Egyptians. That's cool. I never noticed that in the story, so I've been reading it over and over again lately. At this point, Pharaoh realizes that he's sinned. That's actually what he says. He says, I have sinned. And he said, same thing. Make a sacrifice to your God, pray, plead with God on my behalf, tell him to stop the storm. And he does, and God stops the storm, and then Pharaoh hardens his own heart again. And he won't let Israel leave. The next plague is locust, which are like, big grasshopper-looking things that eat everything they touch. They have a couple gods in Egypt that they have a god and a goddess. They're like a team, and they're the god and goddess of grain and crops. So what do locusts do when they show up in town? They eat all your crops. I mean, they eat it down to the twig. They don't leave anything there. So God sends a strong east wind, a strong wind from the east. A strong wind. I'm going to keep saying it to you. Understand what I'm trying to get at here. Haven't we heard about God sending wind in the biblical story? Where were some places that we remember that? God sends a strong wind. Genesis chapter 1. I thought nobody would get this one, but Zach's been reading his Bible, right? Most people think of the flood. The wind blows and blows the waters back, and the waters recede, right? Now, do you remember? This is a real good test now. Do you remember the Hebrew word for wind? Ruach. It's ruach. Ruach, right? It's also the word for God's Spirit. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and the Ruach of God was hovering over the waters. Yeah? Genesis 9, a strong Ruach comes from God and removes the waters from the earth. Now we've got a strong east Ruach. Now, if we were looking at a map, and my left hand right here is Egypt, the Nile River's running right here, which way is the promised land? You got to know your geography now. Most of y'all don't even know where Georgia is. All right. Up here to the east, kind of northeast, is the land of Canaan, which would later be the land of Israel. A strong east wind. Now remember, I told you my opinion of where the Garden of Eden was? It was the promised land. Eden was the promised land. The garden was sitting right where Jerusalem sits today. That's my opinion, and I think I'm right. You can argue with me, but you're probably wrong. Remember, that was the place where God's presence was, in the garden, right? So it's just interesting to me. I might be making too much out of this. It's just interesting to me that the Ruach comes from there, this direction. Anyway, I make too much out of some stuff, and I think it's really cool, and then most people are bored by it. But so this strong east Ruach comes, and it just blows all day and all night. And what's behind God's Ruach that's coming from the east? A whole swarm of locusts, and they cover the whole land. They devour every remaining food source. So what the hail didn't beat down to the ground, the locusts are going to eat it. So now they don't have all their fish died in the river. Their crops got beat up, and the locusts came and ate what was left, and all their animals got killed. They got nothing to eat. Yeah, I mean, I guess they could eat some frogs, huh? Got plenty of frog legs, but I'm pretty sure they were tired of the frogs. So their god of crops and grain. Their gods of crops and grain are out of business. Okay? The next plague is darkness, and this was a big one. This one had to have gotten the attention of the Egyptians. Their highest, most worshipped god is the god Ra. He's the sun god. Now, I've done a lot of studying on this, and I'll try not to tell you too much about it, but here's what they believed. Ra was the sun rising in the morning, and they believed that he was riding on a boat. The sun's riding in a boat, and his name is Ra. Okay? So just picture it. I know it sounds silly, but they believed it. And he's riding on this boat, and he goes throughout the day, and at the end of the day, when he goes down into the underworld. And he has to fight a battle, and he has to fight that battle with a big snake. And he has to win that battle, and if he wins the battle, he gets to come up the next morning. That's what they thought happened every day and every night. That's how the Egyptians think. Their most popular god is a god who's up there during the day. He needs another god to help him in his boat. I guess the other god was rowing the boat. I don't know how they thought about it, but he's going up, and then he has to go fight all night long against other evil gods so that he can come back up the next day. So what does God do? Well, Yahweh shows up in town and says, watch this. 3 days of complete darkness. And it says that it was so dark you could feel the darkness. I don't know what that feels like. I don't know how you feel dark, but apparently it was so dark that it was just like, ooh, for 3 days. So what does that communicate to people who worship a God who rises every morning and goes down and fights every night? He lost a battle. And then the next day they walk outside and they're like, oh no, he must really be dead. I mean, think about it. It sounds silly to us. A whole nation of people think this is their God coming up every morning and shining on them. And he fights a battle every night. And then Moses shows up and says, Yahweh says it's going to go dark. Nah. I mean, I've seen cool tricks, Yahweh. You killed our fish and all that. That's good. But you can't take Ra. I mean, he's going to come up in the morning. I mean, that's how we use that as a metaphor for being dependable, don't we? As sure as the sun rises, you know. That's how they thought. And they're thinking, okay, your God can't do that. But 3 days into darkness that's so thick you can feel it, you start to get the picture that Moses' God is a big deal. He can keep the sun from shining. He took Ra out for 3 days in a row. So this is a big deal. Now the 10th plague is the big part of the story. This is the death of the firstborn. Okay? We call this Passover. Okay? So now what you need to understand, there's a lot going on here, and I can't get into all of it. Gosh, it's already 7:30. Okay, we'll do it quick. In Egypt, the Pharaoh was believed to be a descendant of the god Horus. He was a big god. He was pretty close up there with Ra. And so when you saw Pharaoh in Egypt, you believed that he came from Horus. All right, that's how they thought in the ancient world. A big, powerful leader was the son of a god. That's how they thought about it. I wonder where they got that idea. It might have been because a group called the Sons of God came down and set themselves up as gods. That might have been where they got that idea from. I'm just guessing. You're supposed to laugh. Anyway. So they think Pharaoh is the son of Horus, and Pharaoh's firstborn son is going to take that spot when Pharaoh's gone. Yeah? So what does that tell us? Okay, it tells us that for the survival of Horus, Pharaoh is the proof of it. But what if Pharaoh's firstborn son, who's the heir to the throne, dies? No more Horus. Right? So Yahweh shows up and he says, okay, this is the final straw. let my people go. And Pharaoh says, not doing it. And Moses says, this is going to hit you right in the heart. I mean, you saw what he's done. You even got afflicted with boils and sores yourself, because the other ones were on the land and the people of Egypt. And as it progresses, it starts to affect Pharaoh and his family and his servants. But he still doesn't repent. He says, okay, this is the last one, and if you don't let us go, at midnight, all the firstborn children in this nation are going to be dead. He doesn't believe it. Now, what he does for the Israelites is he tells the Israelites, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go get a lamb. You're going to kill that lamb. You take some of the blood and put it on the doorpost, and put it around the doorpost, the trim of your door, basically. And you're going to go inside, and you're going to eat the lamb. You're going to cook it. You're going to roast it, and you're going to eat it. You're going to have like a little celebration, but don't take off your shoes, and don't get relaxed. You actually need to be ready to leave. Because when this one happens, it's going to happen in the middle of the night. Pharaoh's going to wake up and say, get out. And when he says that, you need to have your stuff ready. Right? So that's what they do. And that's where the celebration of the Passover came from. They still celebrate it today. Jews today still celebrate the Passover. And so do we. We just happen to do it every Sunday when we take communion. Communion is Jesus' version of the Passover. When he instituted the Passover, when he instituted communion, the Lord's Supper, he was celebrating Passover with his disciples. Right? Okay? So do you think it's important that we know the Passover story to understand what Jesus is doing? Exactly. So anyway, Pharaoh doesn't listen. And so a lamb, something else's life, dies in the place of the Israelites. It dies so they don't die. So can I think of something later in the Bible or someone's going to die so others don't? That'd be Jesus. Okay? So you see how important it is that we know these stories? It's very important. What that tells us is we can interpret Jesus' story and understand it more fully by reading the stories that it's based on. Right? You want to understand communion, you need to know what Passover is. If you want to understand Jesus' sacrifice, you need to understand what was going on in the Old Testament with sacrifice. Right? It's really important. So, all right, I've got to decide what not to talk about at this point. I'll just point this out. We'll move off of Passover. Yahweh says in chapter 12, Exodus chapter 12, verse 14, when he tells them to celebrate Passover, he says, you're going to do this from now on. You're going to celebrate this moment from now on. This whole Passover thing. He says, this day shall be for you a memorial day. You're going to do this in remembrance of me. What did Jesus say at the Lord's Supper? That exact phrase. So Yahweh said to Moses and to Israel, do this meal in remembrance of me. Jesus is sitting at a celebration with a group of Israelites celebrating the Passover. Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. What do you think the disciples heard? You're God. Because you just said something that God said in the past. You see it? Isn't this good? Good. I hope it's good. Put a lot of work into this. Okay, so any questions about the plagues? I don't know. That's a good question. Did it hail in Egypt? Yeah, it's a pretty hot area. That'd be kind of strange. I don't know. Does it hail in the desert climate? Anybody? See, my brother's girlfriend's a meteorologist. I could probably ask her. I'll find out. Yeah, he's tearing the garden down. Right. Decreation. hmm Okay, 7:39. Y'all got a few more minutes in you? Slow down. All right. Um, okay, so we're going to skip through a few things. You've got it all in your notes. You can read it later. Watch the Bible Project videos on Exodus. They'll go into some of this stuff a little more. If you're reading through the Bible Project journey on the Bible Project app, if you're doing the journey with us, where we're going through the Torah for the whole year, you're going to get into this in a lot more depth than I'm able to tonight. You're going to read through this a lot slower and pay attention and watch videos and see a lot of things that we miss in our English Bibles. So I'm going to skip through some of this stuff. Chapters, where is it? 13 is what I was looking for. Oh, I guess that's still here. So chapter 13 is going to be all about, he's going to tell them about another feast called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and you need to consecrate the firstborn of everything in your nation to me. In other words, set it aside as holy for the Lord, and God's going to bless the firstborn and all this kind of stuff. Chapters 14 and 15 are the scene of them crossing the sea. And your Bible says the Red Sea. In Hebrew, it is the Reed Sea. The Reed Sea. That's important. Really, it's only important if you're trying to figure out where did they cross. So if you're thinking the Red Sea, you're probably looking in the wrong spot. There was a place called the Reed Sea, and there are archaeologists now that have found a spot they believe to be the spot. It's not the Red Sea, it was the Reed Sea. It's mostly dry today, but it fits the picture pretty well. But as most places over there, they don't really like you digging and proving the Bible to be true. So haven't been able to do much. So they crossed the sea. We all are pretty familiar with that story. Moses is going to sing a song in chapter 15. You didn't know Moses was a songwriter, but he did. We call it the Song of the Sea or the Song of Moses. It's a good song. And then they're going to be out in the wilderness, chapters 16 through 18. So they're not but like 3 days into this whole thing of being free and they get through the sea. They see all this miraculous stuff. They're only like 3 days into seeing all that, and they just start complaining. Where are we going to get water, Moses? Where are we going to get food, Moses? You know, back in Egypt, we had meat to eat. We had bread. We had water. We even had wine. We could party. You just brought us out here to die. Right? They start that up in chapter 16. And they're pretty much going to do that until today. Right? I mean, that's pretty much what God's people do. Right? He brings you through all this great stuff, and as soon as something gets a little difficult, you're like, oh, what are you doing? Why me? You know, that's what people do. So that's the wilderness story. They're going to end up at Mount Sinai. And that's where the story slows down and gets very long, because he's going to start talking about the law. But you can't skip all that. It is a fascinating story. It's a really cool scene. They're at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God shows up in visible form, in the form of a cloud and thunder and lightning and all this. And he's speaking from the storm down the mountain to the people. And you know what the people decide? I don't think we want to go up that mountain to meet with God. Moses, head up the mountain. They don't want to be in God's presence. So Moses goes up the mountain, and he's dealing with God. And long story short, he gets the 10 Commandments. But it's not just 10 Commandments. If you keep reading, there's a whole blueprint for the tabernacle in addition to the 10 Commandments. So he tells him, here are the commands. And then here's what I want you to do. I want you to build me a place where I can hang out with y'all. I'm paraphrasing. That's not how he said it exactly, but that's what he means. I don't want to live on this mountain. I actually want to be with people. Can you think of someone who comes later in the story that Isaiah said would be called Emmanuel, which means God with us? Yeah. So he says, I don't want to live just in heaven and on a mountain. I actually want to come hang out with y'all. You complaining people. Right? So he tells Moses, here are my commands, and I want you to build me a tent. I'm going to live in a tent. It's going to be a mobile tent. So I'm going to hang out with you in the tent, and you're going to pack up the tent. You're going to watch me rise up in a cloud or a pillar of fire at night, and I'm going to go ahead of you, and you'll know which way you need to go. You just follow me. You follow me. Can I think of someone else later in the story that's going to say, come follow me? Are you getting it? Exodus is really important. So build me a house, build me a tent. And he gives him all these very detailed descriptions of how he wants his tent made. And I never knew this growing up, but it's so fascinating to me. The tabernacle is like a mini Garden of Eden. It's loaded with Garden of Eden imagery. And if you've been with us for a while on Wednesday night, you've heard me tell you this before, but if you haven't been here, you got to look into this stuff. It's so cool. God's presence was in the Garden of Eden, right? That's where God's presence would be with his people, right? He was walking with them in the garden. When he tells Moses to build the tabernacle, he loads it with Garden of Eden imagery. So I want you to make a golden lampstand. And it's going to be in the shape of a tree that's on fire. You're going to light the candles. This is the menorah. Yeah, I almost said some other word. That didn't even make sense. Menorah. It's supposed to be a little tree of life. It's going to be in the holy place, in the tabernacle. So the tabernacle has three main sections. The outer court is symbolic of Eden, the region of Eden. And then as you get closer in, you get to the Holy of Holies, which is the most holy place. And only one guy can go in there, and he can only go in once a year, and he's called the high priest. It's the most holy place. What happens if you go in there and it's not the right day of the year? You're dead. Because you just brought sin into God's presence, and you can't survive that. He's too holy. And only the high priest could do that. Not just anybody could walk in there on the Day of Atonement. Okay? So this is loaded with Garden of Eden stuff. I mean, there's images of plants and trees and stuff all in this thing. It's supposed to, you walk into the tabernacle, you would think, I'm in Eden. I'm in God's presence. Right? So I don't have time to dig through that in detail, but just read it. It's really cool. Now, while he's getting all this and they're finished, and he's like, all right, head out. And by the way, you probably need to go quickly, Moses, back down the mountain, because your people already broke the covenant I just gave you. They couldn't wait. Now, he was up there for 40 days and 40 nights. So it had been a minute. But they're down at the foot of the mountain, and what are they doing? Well, they don't know what happened to Moses. They think, man, he went up there, and it looks scary up there, and he probably died. He's probably not coming back. So they go to his brother Aaron, and they say, hey, Aaron, make us some gods so that we can worship them. So Aaron says, well, guys, I mean, did you just see what Yahweh did? I mean, I cannot do that. That's not what he did. He says, okay, everybody take off your jewelry, all of your gold. If you've got earrings, I mean, they just come from Egypt. They've got all the jewelry and stuff. That's very Egyptian. So he says, bring me all your gold, and he melts it down. Aaron melts it down, and Aaron fashions it into a calf, a golden calf. It says Aaron did it. He didn't go get other people to do it. He did it himself. That's important. And it says that they were worshiping, and they were drinking, and they were playing, and they were singing. And the word for playing in in Hebrew means sexually. They were having sexual rituals that they learned in Egypt, and they were worshiping this calf at the foot of the mountain while they're getting a covenant from God at the top of the mountain. So Moses comes down and he sees this, and what does he do? He literally breaks the covenant. He throws the tablets down and they break. He goes up to his brother Aaron and he says, "What happened?" And Aaron has this really neat story. He says, "Well, the people wanted gods to worship, so they gave me all their jewelry and I threw it in the fire and out came a calf." So dumb. So dumb. But that was his story. He thought that was a good story. He thought that was going to work. I don't know how old Aaron was, but he's acting like he's 10, right? So anyway, so they break the covenant right off the bat. So now what has to happen? Moses goes back up the mountain, and what does God want to do to Israel? He wants to get rid of them and start over with Moses. He's like, "Look, I've done this before. I can start over. I'm used to this. Remember Noah? I can start over with one dude. Okay? This ain't a big deal for me. So I'll just wipe them out. I mean, good night." They left the water walking through on dry land and got into the desert and started complaining. They've been complaining for 3 days straight. I can just start over. I don't need them. And what does Moses do? He says, "Wait a minute now. You promised that you would make a great nation out of Abraham's descendants. And you did. Now, what would Egypt say if we got through all of this and then you just killed us all?" Egypt's not going to believe you're real. Egypt's going to say, "Well, whatever, that God retired." And he says, "Yep, I remember what I said to Abraham. So get your chisel back out, Moses." We got another 40 days and 40 nights of rewriting this on some stone tablets. And if you read it, there's some additions to that second telling. It's like, okay, I can clearly see you need a few more rules. So he gives them some more. Long story short, that they get down and everybody says, "Yes, we will do it. We're going to do everything God commanded." That's also what they said before they made the calf. Before he went up the mountain to get the law, it was like, "Yes, we will be in covenant with Yahweh. Whatever he says, we will do it." 40 days later, they're worshiping a calf. He comes back down the mountain. "Okay, I rewrote it, guys. Can we do this time?" They're like, "Yes, we will do all that Yahweh commands." And you're supposed to laugh. Every time you read that, you're supposed to laugh. So the next part of the story is they build the tabernacle, just like God told them to. And they build it. There's only one problem. Moses can't go in. He can't go in the tabernacle. So you're supposed to think, wait a minute, I thought God wanted to hang out with him. And they build him the house, they build him the tent, but he's not letting anybody in. What's the deal? Well, you'll have to read Leviticus. Because Leviticus is going to tell them, all right, you clearly need some rules about how you approach me. So you don't just get to walk into this tent and do whatever you want. There's some guidelines. And that's going to be Leviticus. So we'll get into that next week. Now, here's why this story is really important. Okay? If you're looking at the notes, just scroll all the way down to the end where it says Exodus and Jesus. Or why the Exodus story is so important. We're going to find out toward the end of the Torah in Deuteronomy, the last scroll. In chapter 18, God tells Moses, he says, "Look, I need you to tell Israel this. I'm going to raise up a prophet like Moses. After Moses, you're going to die, and I'm going to raise up someone like you to lead my people." So he promises that in Deuteronomy 18. At the end of Deuteronomy, toward the end in chapter 34, we're told this: "And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." So the Torah ends with telling you, we're still waiting. Moses is gone, and it's been a while. Whoever added that comment at the end wasn't Moses, he was dead. Said, hey, it's been a while, and that prophet like Moses still hadn't shown up. If you keep reading the Old Testament, the prophets carry this idea on even further. They say, okay, that prophet that's going to be like Moses, he's also going to be a king. And he's going to be like a priest. He's going to be a prophet, a priest, king, all in one. That's in Jeremiah, Amos, Chronicles. But the Old Testament ends with, where's he at? He hadn't shown up. And then if you flip one more page out of the Old Testament, you get to the Gospel according to Matthew. And what does Matthew do throughout his entire Gospel? I'll tell you what he's doing, and it's very obvious if you know Exodus well. He's trying to show you that Jesus is the one like Moses that we've been waiting on. I'll give you an example. Moses, through Yahweh's power, shamed the gods of Egypt. And what did he have in his hand every time? He had a piece of wood. He had a tree. He had a piece of a tree. And he shamed the gods of Egypt with a piece of a tree. And then Matthew tells us, and Luke, and Mark, and John, that Jesus shamed the powers of evil by being put on a piece of a tree. Interesting. So something about the Exodus story might help us understand the cross. So we need to know Exodus. Yeah? Moses delivered Israel. But when I say Moses, you know what I mean. Yahweh through Moses. Delivered Israel through water. Right? That's how they got out of Egypt, by going through water. Jesus delivers us through what? Yeah, when we place our faith in him, our first act of obedience should be we go through the water. Interesting. Baptism. Yeah? And by the way, if you read Peter's letter, 1st and 2nd Peter, can't remember exactly what chapter, he connects the flood story and the Exodus and baptism all in the same paragraph. So for Peter, he says, let me tell you how to interpret this. You want to understand baptism, go to the flood story, go to Exodus, and then come back to Jesus. You'll understand what's going on. Moses delivers the law from a mountain. After he had come out of the water, he goes up a mountain and gets a law from Yahweh and gives it to Israel. Yes? Jesus is going to come out of Egypt. Remember, he had to go to Egypt when he was a toddler? Because Herod was trying to kill Jesus, an Israelite. A king of a nation was trying to kill Israelite children. That kind of sounds like Pharaoh, doesn't it? So he's trying to kill Jesus, so he has all the boys in Bethlehem under the age of 2 and under, he has them all killed, so he has to flee to Egypt. So then he comes back from Egypt in Matthew's story. And what's right after that? There's John the Baptist crying out, and then there's chapter 3 where Jesus is going to go into the water. And he's going to be baptized. And then he's going to go into the wilderness. Where did Israel go after they came through the sea and the mountain? They're going to be in the wilderness. And they get tempted, don't they? In the wilderness? Because they don't have water and they don't have food. See, Jesus comes out of the water and he goes directly into the wilderness, and he's led by the Ruach of God into the wilderness. Interesting. And while he's there, he gets tempted and he's hungry. It's like he's a new Israel. Yeah? And then right after his temptation in Matthew chapter 4, we get Matthew chapter 5, because 5 usually comes after 4, in case you didn't know. Um, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is on a mountain, and he's delivering his law. It's like he's a new Moses. Yeah? Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. Moses led Israel to become a kingdom of priests. That was the whole goal, to be a kingdom of priests to all the nations, so you could draw all nations to Yahweh. That was the purpose of Israel. They failed miserably. Jesus made us a kingdom of priests. Yeah? That's what Peter said. That's what Peter wrote. We are a royal priesthood, a holy nation unto our God. The church is the priest of God on the earth. Lost my place. Moses built a place for God's Spirit to live. The tabernacle. Didn't Jesus do something like that? The temple, what's the temple now? Us. So Jesus built a temple, just like Moses did. But Jesus built a better one, because Moses' tabernacle and later Solomon's temple, it was only one spot. But now God can dwell in temples everywhere in the earth. You see what's going on here? See why it's important to know these stories? Because they help us understand what Jesus was up to. What is he doing? Well, if you don't think like an Israelite, you'll miss half of what he was doing. Right? He was the one, like Moses, that God promised would come. And that's why the apostles watched everything he did, and they were like, oh, I see what's going on here. He came out of water. He was tempted in the wilderness. That was kind of like our ancestors. And then now he's on a mountain, and he's teaching us how to live. That's just like Moses. Of course. Moses leads Israel to celebrate Passover. Jesus creates a new Passover celebration during Passover and says, now you're going to do this in remembrance of me. Wow. And then when Jesus is dying on a cross, this is an extra one for free. You won't charge for this one. When Jesus is dying on the cross, at that exact moment, the lamb is being slain in the temple. John tells us, he makes sure to point out what hour it was when Jesus cried out and said it was finished. And if you go do your research, it's the same hour that they would slaughter the lamb. It's like Jesus was trying to say, I'm better than that. Yeah. Moses offered himself in Israel's place after they sinned. We kind of skipped through that on the storyline. The first time when God wants to kill Israel, Moses says, hey, remember what you promised Abraham? And God says, yeah, I do. It's not like I forgot. Yeah, I know. Egypt would really get the wrong message if I killed everybody. So here's what we're going to do. We'll rewrite the tablets, go back down the mountain. Everybody's going to sign up like they did last time and go build the tabernacle. The story progresses and God gets to that point again with them. And Moses actually says, look, don't kill them. Kill me. I'll die in their place. That's exactly what Jesus was doing on the cross. Yeah? Dying in our place. That's why it's important for us to read the Torah. Because it is the foundation that tells us how to interpret the rest of the book. If we don't know think about it. What's a popular novel writer nowadays? I don't read novels, so I have no idea. Anybody read novels? I know some of y'all have been reading Redeeming Love and watching the movie and all that. That's a novel, right? Okay. Huh? What? Frances Rivers. Okay. I had no idea that was what her name was. When men see Redeeming Love, we're like, eh. We read something out. We probably don't read anyway. So a novel, if you pick up a novel and you said, I know there's 5 chapters at the beginning of this thing, but I want to get moving with this, and you start at chapter 13. How well are you going to understand that story? You're probably going to get into chapter 13 and 14 and be like, who's Billy Bob? Like, I don't know who this is, right? So what do you have to do? Well, you have to go back and read from the beginning. That's what most Christians don't do anymore. We like to read verses. Now, here's something very important. Don't ever read a Bible verse. Because when it was written, there weren't verses. It was a story. It was meant to be read as a story. So if you're just flipping around in the New Testament all the time, reading random verses, and you're like, I don't really understand what's going on here. Well, that's because you didn't go read the beginning of the story. We have to know the beginning of the story. And if we meditate on the beginning of the story, the Torah, day and night, we'll be like a tree of life. That's what Psalm 1 says, right? So it's really important that we know this, not just so we can have knowledge in our head. That's not the goal here. The goal is that we continually read and meditate on this repeatedly, and that's going to do something in here to us. It's going to open our eyes. Sunday, we're going to talk about what Paul prayed for the Ephesians, and he's going to say, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened. You really want to be here for that, because it's going to help you understand what we're saying here. As we get this stuff into our minds and hearts, it will change us. The Word of God is living and active, sharper than a two-edged sword, and it cuts deep, all the way to the bone. Not just to the bone, the marrow inside the bone. This is what Hebrews said, chapter 4. So as we continue to read, it's going to do something to us. I don't know how I don't know exactly what he's going to change in you. But I know we all need changing. That's why we're spending so much time on this. It's really important. If you can get the foundation right, you'll understand Jesus better. And Jesus is the one you're supposed to be getting to know. Yeah? Okay, good. All right, homework for next week. Memorize Leviticus. What we're going to do, Leviticus is where most people just stop reading the Torah. Like you get to Leviticus and you're like, good grief. Okay, we get it. Obey the law. But it's really important. So what we're going to do, what you can do this week with Leviticus is just scan through it. You don't have to read every single word of it. Just scan through it. Just kind of get an idea of what's in there. All right, what kind of laws are these? What kind of category of laws is this? So here's what we're going to do next week. Monday or Tuesday, I'll post in Faith Life the Bible Project video for Leviticus, where he kind of talks and walks you through the book. And we're going to focus on the literary sections because Leviticus is designed, it's very intentional how they design that book and where the sections line up. We're going to talk a lot about what kind of laws are we looking at, because all the laws in Leviticus are not moral laws. Most of them are ritual things. When you're in the tabernacle, don't do this, or when you're coming into the tabernacle, here's what the priests need to do. There's a whole section on what the priests are supposed to do and what they're supposed to wear. They had a dress code for the priest. Okay, we're going to dig into that some. But most of the laws in Leviticus have nothing to do with sin. They're not about sin. They're rules for worship. They're rules for what's pure and impure. It has nothing to do with sin. So we're going to dig into that, and I'm going to kind of show you that so that you can at least understand what you're looking at. So breeze through. If your Bible has headings, do your Bibles have that? Your old-fashioned paper Bible? Just read the headings. It'll kind of tell you this section's about these kind of laws or whatever. And just kind of get familiar with it. And then we'll dig into it next Wednesday night and do the same kind of thing. I'll walk you through that chart and we'll see how it's designed and and the important thing is just like we did with Exodus, I'm going to try to show you why it's important for us to know Leviticus to understand the New Testament. Right? Because we're under the new covenant. But if you want to understand it, you got to go figure out the old one. All right. I'm going to pray for us. It's after 8 o'clock. If you want to stay after and ask questions, as usual, we like to hang out here. Some of us hang out till 10 o'clock sometimes. So you can stay as long as you need to. All right. Let's pray.